everybody. Objection Psychology is in session. I'm your host, Lazaro. I'm a USF psychology major, and today we're going to dive, as our first episode, into something that I promise you've probably heard of already. But it's something you may not totally understand, at least yet. And that is forensic psychology. In forensic psychology and in this podcast in general, we're not just going to be talking serial killers, mind games, court cases, although we will mention some of them. We're going to be talking about courtrooms, mental health, the justice system, how it all interconnects, and how psychology quietly, mysteriously, and very importantly, will shape what happens and how it'll cross path with the law. So let's start with this. Whenever I say to you guys, forensic psychology, what does that term mean to you? What comes to mind? Is it by any chance you think they're wearing white coats and it's something that you go in and you dissect, I guess, the brain of a dead person? Is it a shadowy figure in an FBI windbreaker muttering about psychopaths and the profile? There's a bunch of different things. You might even think of Dr. Spencer Reid from Criminal Minds. Or you might even think about one of my personal favorites, Netflix Mindhunter. And trust me, you're not alone in this. You're probably have the same misconception a lot of people do. But here's the thing about that. While those shows and those impersonations of this term are fun, they only show a tiny bit of what forensic psychology actually is and what it entails. So in order to break it down further for you, according to the American Psychological Association, so APA, which is the largest, if not one of the largest psychological databases that exist in current time, forensic psychology is, quote, the application of clinical specialties to legal institutions and people who come into contact with the law. To kind of summarize it in plain terms, forensic psychology is how we use psychology to understand, evaluate, and sometimes even protect people in our legal system. Whether you're the accused, witness, involved in the case in some sort, these same ideals apply. Dr. Patricia Saps, sorry if I butchered that, which is one of the leading experts in this field, would say it best. Quote, the work of forensic psychologists is often quiet, clinical, and deeply human. They interpret behavior, not crystal balls. And that hits hard. It's not flashy, it's thoughtful, it's personal, but most importantly of all, it's critical. Right? It's a functional, so we would describe as a functional definition. Now, moving on, let's kind of dive into what they actually do. What does a forensic psychology actually do? What's their day-to-day? We might even get to, seeing if you're interested in this field, which is a real field, we can even talk about potential salaries. So, but let's just talk about what they actually do. So imagine that someone, a random person, let's say your friend Bob, is accused of a crime, but they don't understand for whatever reason, because of a mental impairment, for whatever reason, they don't understand what's happening in the courtroom. They have no clue what their sentence means. They have no clue what they're being read. They probably don't even understand what the Miranda warning is. They can't communicate with their lawyer, all sort of these things. So then it brings up this question. Can Bob have a fair trial knowing this information? This is where the forensic psychology steps in. Now, I'm going to mention a case that, ideally enough, represents what the importance of a forensic psychology actually is. So, back in the 1960s, there was a case ruling between Dusky versus United States, and this ruling states, quote, that a defendant must have sufficient present ability to consult with their lawyer with a reasonable degree of rational understanding. What that basically means is that somebody who is a defendant and is taking part in a case must have the enough amount of intelligence and ability to be able to have a reasonable degree of understanding, to understand what they're being charged with, understand their rights, understand the law, understand their lawyer, basically to be present in the case and understand why they're getting what they're getting. This is the part where the forensic psychology comes in. A forensic psychology evaluates this. So if the person isn't competent, if the forensic psychology deems this person to not be competent enough to stand in trial and receive their verdict, this person may be sent to treatment, not trial. And justice is paused until their mind is ready. Furthermore, now let's talk about insanity defense. Something that, also forensic psychology actually does. In other words, they do insanity evaluations. And this is a topic that we will go a little bit deeper in a future episode in this podcast. But for right now, let's just kind of evaluate how this connects to what a forensic psychology actually does. So to put it in a quick little version, a forensic psychologist helps determine whether someone understood what they were doing and whether they knew what they were doing was wrong. So in other words, a forensic psychologist will sort of determine if the person had mens rea and if the attack was planned, if the attack was, if it was meditated beforehand, and if they knew that what they were doing was wrong. I know that sounds a little bit kind of hard to understand because some of it seems like common logic. However, there's various and a vast amount of defendants and people who stand in court who have been previously in psych wards, and they do not have the same amount of mental capacity that other people may have. So to keep on going, most states use a version of the Manhattan rule, which asks exactly this. If the person says no, that, they didn't understand what they were doing and they didn't know it was wrong, the person might be found not guilty by reason of insanity, which, to kind of clear up, doesn't mean they go free. It just means they're hospitalized. And to kind of pause a little bit and just kind of give my personal opinion, we see a lot of these cases in current time. Mental health is slowly starting to become one of the topics that people talk about the most. It's becoming something that everybody sort of tends to have. And I'll reference to something that my grandpa said a couple of months ago that has stuck with me ever since. My grandpa said back in his time, back in 1960s, 50s, 70s, whatever you want to call it, there wasn't this conversation about mental health. there was always a reason to be happy. And it just kind of speaks to how psychology has really shaped the world of law. If we hadn't had this generation of bad mental health, as people are referring to it, we wouldn't have these people go free by reason of insanity. And instead, we would see these people go right where they belong. And to kind of clarify, there have been cases, and I'm not going to mention for any contradictory reasons, I don't want to get in any contradictory arguments, but there have been numerous cases where the person isn't, to quote unquote, insane, but they declare it because that's their only way of going quote unquote free. Even if they're hospitalized, that means that they're not in prison. They're still getting mental attention. They're still getting care by health professionals. So it's a way better situation than if they were to be put in a prison. Moving on, another thing a forensic psychologist does is risk assessment, which is another big one. It figures out how dangerous someone is, and it asks questions such as, will they reoffend? Could they harm themselves or others? Are they a threat to society? What measures need to be taken to reincorporate this person back into society? And in order to treat this, in order to diagnose this, psychologists use validated tools such as the HER20 or the static 99 to estimate the future risk of putting these individuals back in society. And just to mention really quick, there have been a numerous amount of advancements in programs, in community programs, community integrations. I know that down here in Florida, we have a specific program which in which prisoners can do community service hours, and they will be then evaluated at the beginning of that trial period and then after it. And a psychologist, will be more lenient to sort of evaluating that individual to be safe to come back into society. Now, moving on, one more thing just to kind of add like an expert witness testimony of what a psychologist does. Is that they actually sometimes, which, I say sometimes happens, doesn't happen a lot, but it is sort of common. And it's the fact that forensic psychologists often testify in court. And you might ask, what's their job in court? Like, what could they possibly say to a judge that may be helpful in a case? And this is the part where, understanding the brain, having that biological foundation, having that neurological foundation of the brain, having a foundation of the DSM-7, having a foundation of behaviors, emotions, disorders, and just any different type of mental anomaly can be really helpful in court, and it can be really helpful to have a forensic psychologist be there. So to sort of explain, a forensic psychologist sort of explains the psychological issues that may be complex to a judge or jury without the jargon. This could be about trauma, memory, or mental illness, and it can change everything in a trial. To put it into perspective, the explanation of these disorders can sometimes change the outcomes of trials. So let's say that, for example, someone is deemed, insane, right? The reason why they might be deemed insane and the specific disorder could be autism, it could be, extreme anxiety, depending on the situation, it can lead to a change in the verdict, and it can lead to change the trial, which, like I've said, it just continues to highlight the importance of how psychology is so important in law. All right, so now that we've gone what a forensic psychology is, now let's go over what it isn't. Like I previously said before, unfortunately, forensic psychology isn't like Criminal Minds or Mindhunter. A common myth that people have is that all forensic psychologies profile serial killers. And the truth about that is that there is a role that does that already, and that's the role of criminal profilers, who often work for the FBI's behavioral analysis unit. But like I've said, most forensic psychologists focus more on the legal processes and the focus on mental health. Another myth that people constantly have is that forensic psychology is mostly about solving crimes, or understanding autopsies, or even performing them yourself. But this is not true at all. And these evaluations, and when forensic psychology actually steps in to help, most often happens after someone has already been arrested. And everything after that, so evaluations, treatment plans, and courtroom decisions, that's whenever a forensic psychologist gets involved. A fun little quote by Dr. Stephen Hart, which he is a forensic assessment expert, is that he says, quote, "The media loves the profiler, but the justice system relies on the evaluator. Couldn't have said it better myself." Now we get into one of our final segments. So, why should this matter to you? Why should it matter to you, to the public, future lawyers, and psychologists? And this is because, like I've said before, the topic of mental health is rising. According to the Treatment Advocacy Center in 2020, they said, quote, "People with serious mental illness are 10 times more likely to be in a jail rather than in a hospital." If that isn't concerning to you, then we have a serious problem. That's basically saying people who are mentally ill are more likely to be incarcerated and commit a crime than be in a hospital getting treated for their illness. Another reason why it should be important to you is because it impacts fairness. Like I was mentioning before, the trial, the Dusky versus the United States trial ruling from 1960. If Dusky wasn't able to understand the trial and understand what his verdict was, or understand any of his rights, how is that fair in our justice system? We always pride ourselves about always having a backup in the Constitution and things always being fair. So imagine if you get put in a trial that you can't understand what's happening. This is where forensic psychologists come in, and they become the safeguards against this. Lastly, another reason why it should matter to you is because it informs policy. The reports by forensic psychologists often shape decisions about incarceration. They help influence diversion programs, and they help in getting involved with treatment to the actual defendant. So, with that being said, I know that, my talking isn't very good, and that this was very, you could say, overwhelming episode. This is probably after a couple of takes already of this same episode. I've reworded a couple of things here and there, but most importantly, no matter how overwhelming I sound, I hope that you found some sort of information and insightfulness in this podcast. And you know, it's gonna be a thing that takes practice for me, but I appreciate anyone who is listening and anyone who got any useful information out of this, who maybe didn't understand what forensic psychology was. And I'm just glad that I was able to help in your pursuit of knowledge. So now we get into what comes next. You know, like next, I'm thinking a whole lot of stuff. Um, Something that I really want to dive into is the topic of insanity defense, which I've said I would cover in a future episode. I want to cover, is it a justice or is it a loophole? Stay tuned for that one. Another topic that I have in the backboard that not yet considering really discussing it is the psychology of false confessions and what really happens during a psychological autopsy. So, like I said, it's not like the autopsy you're thinking, but it is related. So, with that being said, everybody, I appreciate everything. I appreciate all who is listening to this, and I encourage feedback. Do you have any questions, thoughts, tips? I'll have a link to my email in the podcast description. And, if you have any questions that could be featured in the podcast or future episodes, don't hesitate to hit me up. I'm somebody who's always open to feedback, and just like you, I'm in my own pursuit of knowledge. So with that being said, everybody, thank you so much for listening to this podcast today and for listening to our first episode. With that being said, Lazaro out, Objecting Psychology.